Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about fixing democracy around the world. If we were doing this show 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago, I think the show would be all about how America can fix democracy around the world. But today in 2021, it's increasingly unclear whether America is the patient or the doctor. There's a big debate in Washington, D.C. these days about whether or not America should host a so-called democracy summit. Joe Biden wrote a piece in early 2020 suggesting that in the event of him being elected, he would like this democracy summit. My guest today is a man who has done many things on the democracy front. He studied democracy both at UC Berkeley and the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He was a speechwriter for Madeleine Albright, one of our other guests on the show. He was the assistant, and I hope I get this right, the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy in the second Obama presidency. And he is currently a congressman serving the 7th District in New Jersey. His name is Tom Malinowski, for those of you who haven't already guessed. Tom, is that fair? Am I positioning you in the right camp when it comes to supporting this proposed summit for democracy in 2021?
Yeah, I'm in that camp. And you started out by asking whether America is the patient or the doctor. And I would say that the best doctors are former patients. That, if we approach this in the spirit of America is a somehow superior country and we know it all and we know better than everybody else because of the magnificent perfection of our system, then obviously it's not true and it's not going to work very well. And the rest of the world will tell us to go jump in a lake. But as a country that has gone through these struggles and that understands both the fragility and the importance of democracy, I think we have a role to play with others in championing this idea around the world. And I don't think the last 4 years, which were a crisis in American democracy, changed that. I think the last 4 years make it even more important that we do this.
Well, Tom, be a doctor for the moment, a doctor evaluating the health of democracy in America. You lived, like all of us, through the Trump years, if that's the right way of putting it. How sick or healthy is democracy in America in early 2021?
I think it's fragile. And there's my dog. I hope that's okay.
I'm sure your dog has strong feelings about American democracy too.
Yes. Dogs like stability, I think, more than democracy. But anyway, look, it's fragile, but it always has been. I think we made the mistake of taking for granted that America in the 21st century was a completely settled democracy, that there was really nothing more to be done to solidify this tradition. Look at American history. It's been a constant struggle, and we've come very close at many points to losing it all. The Civil War and the Great Depression and the McCarthyist period and the Cold War, the turmoil of the 1960s. It's a very old story, and the forces that Trump stands for and brings forward, they've always been there in American politics. So, all we learned is that we are fallible and fragile, as we always have been. And it's probably a good thing to know, right? It's good to know that you are not invulnerable, because when you know that, you will be more careful and you'll protect yourself better. But hey, I'll tell you this. I lived through the last 4 years. I lived through January 6th too, as a member of Congress, when that mob rampaged through the Capitol trying to kill us and overthrow a democratic election. On the one hand, you can say, can you believe that such a thing could happen in America? That we have almost basically an attempted coup against democracy fomented by the sitting president of the United States. It's extraordinary. But let's broaden it out with a global perspective. imagine if, say, Putin in Russia had to go through a free and fair election, and his opponent Navalny wins that election. And so then Putin gets on the phone to all of his provincial party leaders throughout Russia to say, you can't let this happen. You got to find me the votes to make sure that I win. And they all tell him to go to hell. And then the Russian Duma, the parliament, meets to certify the results of the election. And Putin sends hundreds of thugs to the Duma to beat up the parliamentarians, to stop them from doing this. And they tell him, go to hell. They certify the election anyway. 2 weeks later, Navalny is sworn in as president. Putin retreats to his dacha in Sochi, and he's kicked off Twitter. That'd be pretty good, don't you think?
Are you comparing Trump and Putin directly? Are you suggesting that they're not that dissimilar?
I've always thought the reason Trump wanted the United States to align with Putin is not because like Putin had some hold over Trump, some compromising information. I thought Trump just liked Putin and saw in Putin a reflection of himself, or the man he wanted to be, kind of a stronger, tougher version of the man that Trump really is. I think they have a very similar worldview. And so there was a natural affinity there. So yeah, I kind of am comparing them and pointing out that, if what happened in America in the last 2 months happened in Russia or China or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or any other authoritarian state in the world, we would see it as a triumph of democracy. And so, glass half full, glass half empty. It was threatened. Our system was this close from being very, very badly undermined, but the system worked. It corrected itself in all the ways that proponents of American democracy would say our system is designed to do.
Tom, you sounded pretty cool talking about Putin, but you're not that dispassionate when it comes to that part of the world. You were born in Poland. You lived there until the age of 6. That was pre-1989. Well, Poland experienced its own form of authoritarianism. How much baggage do you carry when it comes to the darkness of authoritarianism, to the way it undermines human freedom, the way it ruins people's lives?
Yeah, I've got a perspective on that comes from my family and the stories that I grew up with, and even some of my own personal memories. I was a very small child when I left Poland, but I remember feeling the people around me, the adults around me, having this sense of complete powerlessness when it comes to authority in the country. There's just nothing you can do. There's the power over there, and they can do to you what they want. And we try to live by avoiding them as much as possible. The idea that there is a government and the job of the government is to serve you, it's to make your life better, to help you. I didn't grow up with that understanding. I've got one very early childhood memory of my mother pushing a wad of cash across a table into the hands of some man. And I know now that she was basically paying a bribe to get us the passports we needed to get out of Poland when I was 6 years old. And I remember that creeped me out, even as a 6-year-old. I didn't know what was going on, but there was just something, the power imbalance was so stark that even, a child can understand we are vulnerable in this situation. And so, yeah, I brought that with me to the United States, and then traveled back as an older person and came to understand it much better. And that influenced me to this day.
Tom, in many ways, you epitomize the successful immigrant to the United States. You came, you made something of yourself, you invented and reinvented yourself as a scholar, as a political activist. So you stand for that freedom to make and remake yourself. To what extent do you see Trump and the Republicans' assault on immigration as also an affront on democracy itself?
Yeah, they're threatened by that idea of America that immigrants have come here to embrace. Look, one thing I remember as a child is just, that I could be an American immediately. I was still Polish as a kid, and I spoke it with my mom the first few years. I was here, and we had Polish food, and that was the heritage. But from the very first days, it was absolutely clear to me that I could be 100% American, because being American had nothing to do with where you were born, the language you spoke, culture, religion, ethnicity. It was this idea that if you embraced, it was yours. And so, I learned everything I could about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, and I memorized the baseball encyclopedia, because that was another way. Baseball was a way for me to become 100% American, but it was possible. And we know that this is not possible in most countries in the world. Ronald Reagan had this wonderful line that, you can go to China, you can live there, you can go to France, you can live there for many years, but you'll never become Chinese, never become French. But here you can be embraced as an American by embracing this idea. And it's such a comparative advantage for us, because we get the best people from around the world as a result. People who are strivers, who are entrepreneurial, who want to remake themselves, reinvent themselves. And Trump stands for another idea, which has also been around since the beginning of America, the nativist idea that we need to build walls and keep all those people out, because somehow those strivers are a threat to us. And in 4 years, Trump and his people did everything they could under the guise of stopping illegal immigration. They did everything they could to stop immigration, period.
But of course, Tom, the America you came to in the 1970s was not a tabula rasa. It has its own history, its own crimes, particularly when it comes to race and the history of African Americans in this country. How do you think the notion of American citizenship, and the theme of citizenship is the center of our third series on How to Fix Democracy, how free of ethnicity, of race, should American sense of citizenship be, given that it has a history, and particularly a history of criminality, of terrible crimes against humanity?
Yeah, well, you can't escape race when talking about American politics. We maybe hoped, and it's okay to hope, maybe we hoped that the election of an African-American president, unique not just in American history, but globally for a democracy to elect as its leader a member of an underrepresented, persecuted minority group, we hoped that would create a new era of post-racial politics, and obviously it didn't. And there was a ugly negative reaction to it that played out in the 2016 election. So you can't avoid it. And right now, in many parts of the country, we are facing a new effort, mostly by Republican state legislatures, to make it harder for people to vote. And the people who they are trying to keep from the polls are generally not people who look like me. And so that old story continues, again, part of the story of America. And yet, Democrats have a majority in the United States Senate right now, in good measure because African-American voters in Georgia, who in the last several years have faced extraordinary voter suppression, were not intimidated, were not deterred. In a sense, almost the more some people tried to take away their vote, the more valuable that vote seemed to them, and the more determined they were to cast it. And they, stuck the final nail in the coffin of the Trump administration, in effect, by giving the Senate to the Democratic Party.
We've talked a lot about Georgia and voting rights in this series. We had the distinguished Emory University scholar Carol Anderson. I'm sure you know her work on the show. And of course, we've talked a lot about Stacey Abrams. How central do you think the story of Stacey Abrams and Georgia should be if America was to hold a summit of democracy? Do you think Joe Biden should, so to speak, wheel Stacey out as exhibit number one in terms of fixing democracy in America?
If he did, she would, of course, be the first to say we haven't fully succeeded, and that's fine. And actually, one of the best ways to advertise American democracy to the rest of the world is to show people that we acknowledge our faults and that we're open to criticism, that we eagerly embrace debate about what's still wrong with America. You know, when one of the stories my family told me from their time in Poland in the 1960s, the communist government put on television as much footage as they could of the civil rights unrest in the American South, hoping that this would show people in Poland, look how racist Americans are, look how much injustice there is in this so-called democratic country. And in fact, the lesson that most Poles drew was, look, they're marching, they're voting, they're challenging their government, they're on television doing this, they're exercising their freedoms to make their country better. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that here behind the Iron Curtain? So I think it would be great to have Stacey Abrams at the Democracy Summit to talk about our own struggles and some of the legal and institutional reforms that we have put into place and still are working to put into place to protect these freedoms that we have.
There's been a great deal of debate, Tom, about this summit. Our mutual friend, Jim Goldgeier, you know him from Washington, D.C., I know him from grad school. He's argued I think, quite convincingly that America needs to show more humility and that it's not the right time to do a summit. America isn't very good at being humble, is it? Do you think you could have a summit and at the same time manifest that humility by articulating the fact that American democracy is anything but perfect and is in many ways as fragile as many other democracies around the world?
Yeah, of course. And I don't think Joe Biden is the kind of guy who thumps his chest and says, I'm better than you. I don't think he's going to say, you know, whether it's talking about himself or talking about America. Look, I agree that the United States has to show humility, but I don't think the world can wait for the United States to fix all its problems either. You know, just give you one example, in Joe Biden's first month in office, the military in Burma overthrew a democratically elected government. Now, I'd like to ask you to try to go to Burma right now and find one of these brave young people who is facing the guns of the military every single day, demonstrating to get their government back, and to say to that young person, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. And there are things we could do right now to help you in your struggle. But I'm sorry to inform you that because of some minor relative to Burma problems in our democracy recently, we just don't think we have the moral right to help you. And so you're just going to have to be on your own for the next couple of years. What do you think that young person would tell you? Would they say, no, we're good. We're good here. We'll just sit in prison and be tortured for a couple of years. You guys, you know, go pass some voting rights legislation. Come on. History doesn't wait for anybody to achieve perfection. We've got to do both at the same time.
You grew up under the shadow of the Soviet regime in the 20th century, of course. The great debate, as most historians put it, was between the free market capitalism of the West and the Soviet system. 1989 resolved that debate. It was clear that the Soviet system had lost. In the 21st century, though, it seems the great debate is between what sometimes appears like an efficient Chinese authoritarianism versus what seems to be an inefficient Western democracy. I bring that up particularly because of the Burma case you bring up, that young Burmese intellectual who's risking their life, no doubt will also be aware of the Chinese model breathing down their neck. Do you see that as the great debate of the 21st century between the Chinese and the American model? Or the Chinese and at least the Western model?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a Chinese model, though, versus a Western model. It's two old ideas that have been around forever and that exist in both Eastern and Western society. There is an authoritarian model that says that there needs to be a strong state that can compel people to do what it wants to maintain order, and that places the interests of the nation as a whole ahead of the interests of individuals within that nation. And then there is a liberal democratic model that focuses on rule of law and the importance of everybody, especially the most powerful people in a society, respecting the rules, that trusts people to exercise their freedoms within certain reasonable limits. That's always been the debate. And probably right now, if you want to look at some of the best examples of the democratic model, not only guaranteeing people their liberties, but protecting them against things like COVID, I'd look to Taiwan, which is a Chinese society and does both incredibly well. And so, yes, that is the contest. And there is a dictatorship in Beijing, which takes one side, and a strong and a powerful democratic country known as the United States that takes the other side. But I wouldn't call it Chinese versus Western.
Tom, you've broken some eggs, so to speak, in public recently in your criticism, I think, of Egypt and of Saudi Arabia in terms of the Khashoggi investigation. How uncompromising do you think the United States should be in terms of its relationships with undemocratic countries, authoritarian countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and of course, Burma?
First of all, the Khashoggi case, that's really simple. This isn't a human rights, I mean, it's a human rights issue, but it's not that first and foremost. This is a foreign dictatorship that wasn't satisfied with murdering its critics within its country. It actually reached beyond its borders to somebody in the United States of America and lured them to an embassy and murdered him. You don't do that to somebody who's under our protection, who's living in the United States, and then say you want to have a relationship with the United States government. That's ridiculous. So I think we're now seeing the Biden administration assert there's a line here that just cannot be crossed anymore, whether it's Egypt or Saudi Arabia or anybody else. You do not mess with Americans, especially on our soil. Beyond that, again, I think our comparative advantage as a country is that we are associated with these rights and freedoms that people aspire to all over the world. And it would be stupid for America or any other country to squander its comparative advantage, not to lead with that. And so I'm glad the Biden administration is talking in those terms.
What about Europe, Tom? Some people argue that the democratic systems there are somewhat sclerotic, uninspiring. When you look at Europe, are you encouraged? Are you encouraged, for example, by Brexit or by this shift to authoritarianism, it seems, in Central and East Europe? You're indeed in Poland, where you were born, or are there more optimistic models, perhaps in Southern Europe, in Southeast Europe, where democracy is flourishing?
Well, I guess as an American, it's good to know that we're not the only messed up country, and that that this contest is within the United States, it's within France and the UK and Germany and Poland and Hungary and everywhere else. It's good to have that perspective. I think a lot of it is the change in the way we get our information, the role that social media is now playing in dividing societies and polarizing us and pushing people on the left for the left and on the right for the right. That's a whole another thing we're going to have to tackle to heal democracy, in my view. But I do like to think that America leads by example, and that by choosing a president and a House and a Senate that rejects that kind of populist authoritarian politics, that we will have set a good example for our friends and allies in Europe as well.
One of our partners, Tom, in this series is a Canadian nonprofit. Does America have anything to learn from the Canadian democratic system? Are they doing a good job when it comes to the invention or reinvention of citizenship, disentangling it, for example, from ethnicity?
It seems to me that Canada is doing an excellent job. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes Canada, one of the things that makes Canada such a great and important ally of the United States. I'm glad we now have a president who sees that and who was happy to make his very first phone call to a foreign leader, to the leader of Canada, as Joe Biden did, as against Trump, who, when told that that was the tradition, I think was pretty grumpy about it. We're two countries that need each other, and Canada needs America to be, the United States to be strong, and vice versa. And it's good to see that Canada, at least in the last 4 years, has not gone through some of the strange trials that the United States and some of our European friends have.
Tom, you mentioned social media earlier in terms of the crisis of democracy or the problems with democracy. You've been pretty outspoken about the need to reform Section 230, this piece of the infamous Telecommunications Act of 1996, which essentially gave social media, there were no social media companies then, internet companies, a degree of carte blanche when it came to their accountability for what gets published on their platforms. Do we need to get rid of 230 or reform it when it comes to protecting democracy?
I would reform it. I don't want to kill the internet, but Section 230 basically says that these companies are just community bulletin boards. We post information on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and we're responsible for what we post, just as if we were, pinning a notice to a bulletin board at your local public library. And Facebook and Google, they're not responsible for what we post. It made sense in the early days of the internet, but it doesn't today, because what these companies do when we post a piece of information is that they write a very powerful algorithm that scours all the people of the world who are on social media, which is basically everybody. And it figures out, okay, who wants to see this? Who is susceptible to this message? Who might like this? And it delivers that information to tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people, depending on what the algorithm decides. And they do this because by giving people what they think we want, they get us to stay glued to the screen, to their platforms for longer and longer and longer periods of time, and they make money that way. And the effect is basically what I described, that if you're a little bit on the left, Facebook's algorithm will figure that out, and they'll feed you more and more and more content that is designed to push you even further in that direction. If you're a little bit on the right, exactly the same thing. And eventually, you end up in a QAnon rabbit hole, and you end up, and we have the problems that we've had in the United States and in so many other societies. So, I think we got to reform 230. I think we do need to make these companies, we need to expose them to at least some liability for the content that they promote with their algorithms, if that content leads to violence of the sort that we saw on January 6th in Washington, for example.
Tom, finally, if indeed this summit happens and you're invited to give a speech about strengthening citizenship in the 21st century, you've talked a little bit about that already today. What else would you say, very briefly? What would the speech be about? Would it be a story of your life, of somebody else's life?
Yeah, I talk about my life. I talk about the life of America's democracy as we have here today, and how democracies around the world and people committed to this concept. We gotta, if we don't hang together, we hang separately. as Ben Franklin famously said a long time ago. And I talk about some of the things we need to do. It's not enough just to say nice things about human rights and freedom, but we need to work together to actively counter the efforts of the populist authoritarian powers like Russia and China and those forces within our country to undermine democracy. We got to reform social media. We've got to make a really big concerted push against high-level corruption, against kleptocracy, because that's something that undermines public confidence in democracy and also strengthens autocrats like Putin and Xi Jinping. We've got to make our own societies a model for the world to follow, not just through freedom of expression, but right to privacy, for example, something that might not have been as big of an issue 30, 40, 50, or 100 years ago. So I would say this, I would use it as a call to action and coordination on concrete policies to strengthen our democracies and to counter directly what Russia, China, and some within our societies are trying to do to undermine them.
Well, Tom Malinowski, the congressman from the 7th District of New Jersey, I think you've convinced me at least of the need for this summit. I hope it happens. I hope you speak. And I really want to thank you so much for appearing on How to Fix Democracy. It's a real honor. And we'll look forward to having you on the show again in the not too distant future to talk about how America is indeed helping to fix democracy around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.